Race war in high school. The 10-year destruction of Franklin K. Lane High School in Brooklyn. Harold Saltzman. Chapter 7. The Last Days.
Just as the flag incident provided the backdrop for the riot of October 31st, the riot itself was a signal for another month of seemingly endless turmoil. If outside adult groups had played a minor role prior to the riot, they assumed major status after it. On November 2, a number of federally funded anti-poverty agencies, including the East New York Alliance, the Brownsville Community Council, and the East New York Community Corporation, coalesced to come to the aid of the militants. Holding a press conference, they charged that the violence of October 31st was a police riot and demanded the removal of law enforcement authorities from the school. Several of the militant student leaders were on hand and presented a version of what had touched off the riot. A spokesman for the militants said that the trouble started in the cafeteria when a black girl refused to produce an identification card requested by a teacher on duty. The student claimed that the 4 policemen who were on patrol in the cafeteria were called to the scene, and according to the youth,
Then the cops came and started beating on this girl. We could all see it. Pretty soon everybody started throwing milk and stuff. The teachers start something and then they call in the cops to do their dirty work.
Emerging as a key figure immediately following the riot was Mrs. Olivia Taylor, head of the East New York Alliance and a member of the District 19 Rump School Board. Fiercely nationalistic about the black movement, and with a long history of anti-teacher and anti-UFT activism, Mrs. Taylor headed up an ad hoc committee calling itself the Black Parents Emergency Committee. Assisting Taylor was Lloyd Mapp, recipient of a $10,000 per year salary in federal monies as the education director of the East New York Anti-Poverty Agency, and Thelma Hamilton, head of the Brownsville unit. Together they came to fan the flames of discontent and pour more fuel on the brightly burning fires. After the riot, on the afternoon of October 31st, local whites had marched in front of the building as a protest against the violence. Now, Monday, it was to be the blacks' turn. The Afro-American Students Association was busy over the weekend, too. Militant leaders greeted the black students on Monday morning with flyers stating,
"This has got to stop." A beautiful black sister and a member of ASA, who has a rheumatic heart condition, was brutally beaten by a slimy white pig, badge number 29336. A boss brother and ASA member who had polio as a boy and his left leg is injured as a result of this illness, who was beaten and thrown through a plate glass window of the Finest supermarket by 2 pigs, badge number 470 and number 476. 9 other brothers and sisters arrested by rampaging pigs. Students at F.K. Lane have been vamped on by Principal Celeb, teachers, UFT, and the pig because they tried to raise the red, black, and green flag of the black nation. We believe that the brutal racist attacks on our black brothers and sisters have got to stop. The pig school system has never educated black people and now they are trying to beat and brutalize our young brothers and sisters. Let's put an end to this whole mess. No more pig school system. Remember, from now on, don't participate. No pledge to flags. No singing of songs. No assemblies. No lunchrooms. No athletic teams.
There would be no peace at Lane for some time. The school was an armed camp on the morning of November 3rd, the first school day after the riot. Only a few hundred students were in actual attendance and classes were dismissed at 11 a.m. to allow for school conferences. The dim view teachers took of the credibility of school officials was reflected in the statements to the press of chapter chairman Bauman and Johnson.
Corrections have to be made here. We're a little skeptical about the proposals made because of what has happened in the past 5 years.
In accordance with the Gracie Mansion Agreement, High School Superintendent Jacob Zach came to Lane early Monday morning to meet with the chapter representatives. Suspicious of the board's willingness to come up with any plan that would effectuate immediate and meaningful relief, Bauman and Johnson drafted their own proposals based on their own understanding of the school's problems and needs. At the appropriate time, their 9-point program was unveiled to the participants of the morning conference. They recommended
1. Security, permanent complement of 12 to 15 security guards. Restoration of cuts in 8-hour allotments. 2. Immediate freeze on all new admissions from November 4 through June 30, 1970, which shall be applicable to transfers and new admits. 3. A team of attendance experts will be assigned to Lane to determine the extent of truancy, out-of-zone students, etc. 4. All efforts consonant with Board of Education bylaws and state education law shall be made between November 1969 and February 1970 to schedule the school for a single session for the spring term. 5. In September 1970, the incoming 9th and 10th grade classes shall not exceed the maximum number of students necessary to maintain the school on a single session for the 1970-71 school year. 6. Central Zoning will conduct a thorough re-examination of Lane's zone, its feeder pattern, et al. With a view toward making revisions to assure the sustenance of an integrated student body and to reverse the trend toward segregation at Lane. 7. The assistant superintendent in charge of the high school division should clarify for the benefit of the faculty the Board of Education policy on 5-day suspenses and delineate at which point a student may be referred to his office for administrative suspense. This request results from contradictory statements made by Mr. Celeb at Lane High School and Mr. Zach at the October 31 Gracie Mansion Conference. 8. The deans should furnish the superintendent of schools with a list of names of students who incited or participated in acts of disruption since October 23, 1969, and whose continued presence in school is, in their
The deans
view, a clear and present danger to the student body. 9. It is understood that as part of Mr. Montserrat's commitment, made at the Gracie Mansion meeting, the board and the union will confer centrally on the matter of revising the educational curriculum to provide specialized job orientation and training for those youngsters who are not college-bound.
Jacob Zach was new on the job. He had been appointed assistant superintendent in charge of the city's 91 high schools as a result of the new decentralization legislation which removed the high schools from the jurisdiction of the local school boards and re-centralized them under the direction of the central board. The meeting was convened in Celeb's office early Monday morning. With Zach was one of his chief assistants, former high school principal Walter Wolf. Joining Celeb were his assistants, Peter Tadero and Mary Cohen. Altamari and I sat with Bauman and Johnson comprising the UFT team. Also participating in the discussions was Richard Strider, the mayor's representative from the school task force. With only 24 hours left before the opening of the polls, Lindsay had a vital stake in seeing to it that the talks didn't break down. Zach quickly took command of the meeting. He started by advising that the commitments he was about to make came directly from the superintendent himself, and that Brown was intent on following through on every pledge about to be made. The UFT chairmen held their own proposals in abeyance while Zach promised them a team of attendance experts. The daily attendance had dropped to 51%, and the immediate rescheduling of the school for a single session. All the school's programming and reorganization personnel would be brought in on Election Day, Tuesday, and on the following weekend to reprogram the school. They would be paid at the hourly rate of $10.25. The high school superintendent honestly believed he had brought glad tidings that would more than satisfy the UFT chapter, and he was anxious to go before the faculty with his wonderful news. Zach had tried to speak at the faculty meeting following Celeb's seizure on the afternoon of the riot. Never before in his professional life had he met with as much hostility from subordinates. But to the staff Zach was the enemy, representing as he did the bureaucracy that had doomed their school to this sufferance.
What are you going to do to get us out of this mess?
One teacher had challenged. On Friday Zach didn't have an answer. Now he had something concrete to tell them, or so he thought. When Zach finished making his report, a report that included few of the essential commitments demanded by the chapter leaders, Bauman presented the chapter proposals. Zach and the others were taken by surprise. They didn't expect a set of demands, and the high school chief retracted, becoming defensive. Mechanically, he began his response to the 9-point program. No, there couldn't be security guards at Lane because the budget didn't provide for it, but if the mayor supplied the money. Gracie Mansion all over again. No, there would be no freeze on admissions because other high schools were even more overcrowded than Lane and it wasn't fair to relieve one school while others were bulging even more. No, there would be no guarantee of a single session for September 1970, nor could there be any commitment for a rezoning to relieve racial imbalance. And no, he would not crack down on the militants because a buckshot approach would bring Kenneth Clark down on them again and put the board in trouble with the civil liberties people who had left last term's court case hanging. He reminded the UFT delegation that Clark, a member of the State Board of Regents, was still breathing heavily down the board's neck concerning the implementation of last May's court ruling. Finally, no, there could be no assurances for a comprehensive restructuring of the school's academic program to provide specialized job and career orientation for those students who are not college-bound. Zach had nothing in his pocket except a guarantee to go on to a single session right away. It was the old public relations game, and it was intended to take the board off the hook. Now if something happened during the reorganization period, which was expected to last several weeks, they could always point to the rescheduling to show that something was being done. If there was a blow-up afterwards, no one could say the board had been non-responsive. It was a clever hedge for Nathan Brown, and Zach played it to the hilt. Anyway, they could reason, wasn't the single session a key union demand? If Celeb had been the maverick at Gracie Mansion, he had by Monday reversed his field, and he took his signals directly from Jacob Zach. There was no question about where he stood on this day. Zach's word was gospel, and every UFT doubt, fear, and counterproposal was subject to the principal's piercing attack. He had made his peace. Instead of standing up to fight for his school against the bureaucrats who had led it down the path of ruination, and who were ready to throw him on the scrap heap along with it, he was now quite willing to play their game. There was no relief, no real change, nothing except a shallow promise to condense the school day. Zach was a tough negotiator, and in spite of a full day of discussion he conceded to no more than he originally presented from Nathan Brown. Grudgingly, the chapter leaders agreed to go before the faculty, with Zach and Celeb, in support of a package they knew didn't fill the bill. It was a major error for which the entire UFT delegation was responsible, including Altamari and myself. Zach had been so convincing in his promise that Lane would be given the very closest attention and most preferential treatment in the future. With the chapter's acceptance of the Zach proposals that afternoon went the last hope of bringing a sound and innovative educational program to Lane. We all knew that we had failed in our mission, that we had been bought off cheaply, that we had forgotten the painful lessons taught by years of broken promises. Zach was a school politico, and like the rest of the breed, would quickly forget about Lane, once it was out of the public eye. November 4th was election day and the people of the city of New York gave John Lindsay another 4-year lease on Gracie Mansion. When Lane reopened the next day, Sonny Carson, the militant former head of Brooklyn Corps, was waiting at the school telling newsmen he was there
to confront school officials and to cash in on our first payment from Mayor Lindsay for the black votes he received in the election.
Olivia Taylor and Lloyd Mapp arrived with a delegation of about 40 concerned parents from the black community. Demanding to meet with Celeb regarding the suspension of militant student leaders, their presence in the building sparked a new wave of violence. A newspaper reporter who had made his way into the school gave this eyewitness account.
Throughout the morning, bands of white and black students swarmed through the hallways, which were heavily patrolled by police and teachers. The rampaging students were sent back to their classrooms, but other groups replaced them in the hallways. At 11:30 a.m., kerosene was tossed into the crowd of more than 1,000 students in the cafeteria. It smacked into the walls and students were hit by flying glass. However, the kerosene did not ignite. Chaos followed with groups of up to 30 students thronging into the cafeteria. Fistfights broke out and tables and chairs were thrown. After 30 minutes, police broke up the melee.
On November 5th, school officials were unable to guarantee the safety of students and teachers at Lane. It appeared that they had chosen to close their eyes to the open warfare. People in responsible governmental and educational positions were paralyzed with fear. No one was in control of the school, except, perhaps, the militants. They directed their cadres with precision timing. They had planned their morning's activities well, and when they went into action it was like a well-oiled drill team. Bauman and Johnson were outraged at Celeb's failure to act. The anger they had suppressed all week over the Gracie Mansion sellout by the UFT heads, and their own self-blame for having let Zach off so easily, now surfaced. Celeb had been wandering about all morning trying in futile desperation to pull things together. But no one was listening. Realizing the dimensions of the breakdown, he returned to his office to put through an emergency phone call. Several of the deans and coordinators and the chapter chairman had already congregated in Celeb's office simultaneously to demand the closing of the school. But the principal had already reached that decision and dialed the superintendent of schools. "The situation here is out of control," he told Brown. The principal wanted permission to shut down the building. From 110 Livingston Street came the official reply: the school must stay open, no matter what. Celeb was reminded of Montserrat's edict about school closings under fire. The principal's face reddened. No one at Lane had ever before seen him lose his composure. But the order to keep the school open was insanity, and more than he could bear.
Okay.
He shouted back at the superintendent.
I'll do whatever you want, but if anything happens to any of these kids, I'm not going to be responsible.
Celeb slammed the receiver down on the hook and repeated to the gathering the choice words he had for the superintendent. Bauman took it from there, calling Schenker's office to tell Sandra Feldman about the Brown-Celeb tiff. At that very moment Schenker was on the phone with Brown. Minutes later the union president was talking to Celeb. Had the principal actually requested Brown to give him the go-ahead to close the school? Schenker wanted to know. Celeb, realizing that an affirmative answer would place Brown in a box, evaded the question. He began retracting, modifying what he had said. Evasively, he parried Schenker's questions. By the time he was finished he was categorically denying any difference with the superintendent. Of course he could keep the school open. And he did. But Morton Celeb's problems were just beginning. The Woodhaven Cypress Hills Community Association had initiated a boycott, keeping most of the neighborhood youngsters out of school. On this day they carried their fight directly to the principal. Celeb had made the mistake of letting Carson and followers enter the building earlier in the day. Now the association leaders demanded equal time. Celeb refused. Putting on his overcoat to shield himself from the light snow that had begun to fall, he went out into the street to face the angry mob of local whites. Insulted and berated, abused and humiliated, he stood there, a mere shadow of a man, while the demonstrators charged him with cowardice and malfeasance. While 100 mothers marched around a police barricade shouting,
"Celeb must go."
Long and Galliani charged that
Celeb and his two deputies, Tadaro and Cohen, proved themselves incapable of handling discipline at the school and must be replaced.
Celeb's weak and vacillating approach to the crisis had left him alone, without allies, with no base of support. Even teachers, who had a natural sympathy for him, could not stand by the principal on this day. And on this first day after the election, from City Hall came the terse statement that
the mayor was watching the Lane situation closely and that members of his staff were working with school officials, faculty members, and the police to make sure all necessary steps are taken to maintain the orderly educational process.
Not all the faculty members at Lane agreed on the causes of the breakdown. Maurice Gums, an anti-UFT teacher, gave an interpretation of the situation as seen through the eyes of the blacks. In a blistering attack against the staff, he posted an open letter on the faculty bulletin board entitled,
"Why is there trouble in Franklin K. Lane?" It requires no brilliant sociological analysis to determine that when a predominantly white staff, middle class and conservative, drives in from the suburbs to meet a group of black ghetto children there is bound to be unrest. Delete black and white if you will, the statement remains equally true. If there was any doubt about the nature of the problem, it was quickly dispelled at Friday's
October 31st.
faculty conference. The smell of fear, reaction, and hysteria was very strong at that meeting. There was Miss Art sobbing about students being scalped and burned. There was the elderly man with the pro-casino button and rabbinical training, shrieking about Fifth Avenue shysters who were trying to run the school. There was the tall physical education teacher warning solemnly that the school should be closed. Then there was the kindly-looking deputy superintendent,
Zach.
whispering about muggings in his buildings, of international intrigue, and a plot to take over the school. And brisk Mr. S, pleading,
What is going to happen on Monday?
yes, and a hysterical voice screaming.
Remember Siracusa.
Finally, the big moment when Mr. J let it all hang out shamelessly and received the loudest applause of the day. Images of black buck savages raping the helpless white women.
I wouldn't want my mother or sister down there with them.
Black animals running wild.
It's a zoo down there, student cafeteria. 500 of them backing me against the wall.
Black burheads being bloodied. Put them in the streets so the police can take care of them like they should. Even the black bodies lying in the cafeteria as an example.
I don't understand why the police did not draw their weapons.
Only applause for Mr. J. No protest against his criminal remarks, suppression of the symptoms with no desire to touch the real problems, no introspection. For the future, angry black boys and girls will keep coming to Lane from rat-infested homes in the ghetto. They will not be gentle and submissive to start with. Very quickly they will meet and recognize the contempt and fear expressed on Friday. They will react. They will close ranks, becoming brothers and sisters in the face of the enemy. If there is anything definite, it is that there will be increasing unrest and violence at Franklin K. Lane.
About the continued unrest and violence, there was no question. The student militants were not wanting for support in the black community. Solidly behind them were the Carsons, Mapps, Taylors, Campbells, and black teachers like Gums, who all chose to excuse the violence by philosophizing about the root causes steeped in the pathology of ghetto existence. The time was ripe for Kenneth Clark to step back in, and he did. The noted educator, regent, social scientist, and author called a press conference to charge
Systematic harassment
of minority group youngsters at Lane. Pointing especially to the UFT and the white community, he alleged discrimination against black students by special interest groups which were
systematically excluding minority group children from their right to an education.
A shudder went through Nathan Brown. Kenneth Clark had become a sacred cow in educational circles, wielding vast power. He was hailed by many as the outstanding national authority on the subject of educating ghetto children, and in New York City he was above criticism. No one saw fit to question Clark's motives. No one asked why Clark hadn't spoken out against the inhuman atrocities that were being perpetrated on whites by black youths. The witch hunt he called for would be conducted by his own Ford Foundation-funded Metropolitan Applied Research Center, MARC, which would demand a purge of white racist teachers, sadistic club-swinging police, and the bigoted local community. Such was the frame of reference the noted educator brought to the already troubled scene. The crisis in the city's high schools began getting more local as well as national attention. In February 1970, the New York Times ran a series of articles about the troubled high schools. One report focused on the environmental conditions in the ghetto, which made educational achievement almost impossible for large numbers of black youths. In explaining the high rate of truancy, for instance, the study noted,
Some are so poor they have no time for anything but the struggle to stay alive, some are frustrated by their inability to do high school work, some are rebelling against parental and teacher authority, some are sapped of energy by asthma and other chronic ailments, some are living the half-lives of drug addicts, some are turned off by studies in which they see no sense.
The article went on to talk about the free hot lunches in school, which for many of the youngsters is the only decent meal they get. And it talked about the broken, chaotic, and unstable homes, and of muggers lurking in hallways, and of the prevalent diseases which make education seem unimportant compared to the everyday struggle to stay alive. A guidance counselor in a troubled school summed it up best when he said,
No real change is going to take place in the schools until there are fundamental changes in the society outside the schools.
Earlier, I had written to New York State Governor Nelson Rockefeller and to legislative leaders, urging action on some of the educational reforms needed in the high schools. The letter was in response to press reports that Lane students had helped turn the state legislature into a shambles on January 12, 1970, during a lobbying campaign organized, in part, by Leslie Campbell and the Afro-American Students Association, of which he had become chief adult advisor. I wrote. I was alarmed, but not surprised, to learn of the abuse heaped on the legislature yesterday by a group which included a sizable delegation of students from Franklin K. Lane High School. The teachers who watched the buses depart from the school had little doubt that the legislature was to be subjected to a small taste of the violence and terror that has become something of a routinized way of life at our school. You were exposed yesterday to just a minuscule sampling of what has been the general order of things at Lane High School for 14 months, 1% of a 5,000 student body being permitted to turn the school into a battleground and create the ugliest kind of racial polarization. In addition to legislation to revise pupil suspense procedures and to bring schools like Lane into the realm of manageability, the message also concentrated on the need for educational reform in the high schools. Funds must be appropriated for a rather comprehensive and realistic program focused on job orientation and career training which will truly meet the needs of those non-college bound youngsters who are most alienated by the current general course of study, and for whom the high school experience is irrelevant. If our high schools are to survive, if the dream we share for an integrated society is to be realized, if educational reform is to be an answer to bring the alienated into the mainstream, then it would appear that this problem must be a priority for this legislative session. Lane High School had become more than just a microcosm of society. The groups and the individuals who were continually inciting the disturbances were well known to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. At the time of the October 31st riot, Lindsay announced that he had asked Brooklyn District Attorney Eugene Gold to conduct a special investigation to determine if there had been any criminal activity connected with the disruption. If the investigation was ever conducted, nobody associated with the teacher leadership of the school was aware of it, nor were any findings revealed. The militants continued to force their will on the school. There was little hope left as November drew to a close. Lane High School was, in every sense, a freak institution, an orphan of the educational system. What hope could there be for a school that was considered too hot to handle even by the local politicians? It was a school to which neighborhood residents refused to send their children, a school from which teachers sought to transfer, and into which others refused to accept assignment. The future couldn't have been darker. It didn't take long for the faculty to realize that the mayor and the school board had again begged off the Lane controversy. Neither Seymour Lockman, the Brooklyn School Board member, nor Murray Bertraum, the Queens member, was going to inject himself into the problem of a school that sat squarely on the boundary line dividing their respective boroughs. And even Jacob Zach was growing wary because of all the time and attention this one school was requiring from his staff and from him personally. The promise of immediate conversion to a single session was a neat ruse perpetrated by the school board to cover itself in the event there was another explosion that semester. But there was a direct correlation between the incidents of disruption and the administration's movement toward actually implementing it. On Election Day, November 4th, and on the following weekend, more than 50 teachers were employed for nearly 900 man-hours to reprogram the school for a single session. The cost of the job, more than $9,000, money squandered since the single session was not put into effect that semester. On Friday, November 7th, after another week of turmoil, Bauman and Celeb jointly announced that they had reached agreement on implementing the single session. The pressure was still on. The union chapter had even gone as far as to allow a variance in its contractual limitation on class size.
Under our contract with the Board of Education,
Bauman said,
we can have no more than 34 students on register in any class. We have agreed, reluctantly, to allow larger numbers here at Lane so that we can get a single session as quickly as possible.
He was sure to add.
However, it must be made quite clear that this is an emergency situation. And what we are doing is the only available solution.
Meanwhile, the reorganization toward a single session proceeded. But it was soon obvious that the administration was stalling as long as possible, hoping to limp through to the end of the semester without a midterm shift. Several department chairmen had objected to the consolidation of classes in mid-semester and had persuaded Celeb to hold off. The union chapter, aware of the game Zach and Celeb were playing, didn't push the issue since it was the February semester they were primarily concerned with. But there was no end to the chain of deterioration. On November 7, school's Superintendent Brown visited the school, and after implying his criticism of Celeb for having allowed Sonny Carson to enter the building, he emphasized to waiting reporters that there would be no discharges, transfers, or suspensions to achieve the single session.
Under no circumstances will we remove any students in order to reduce the number of those on the school register,
he said. By mid-November there was still no single session in spite of the $9,000 expenditure for reprogramming. At the same time, new students were still being admitted into the already overcrowded school, and on November 14 I wrote to Zach reminding him of the discussions of November 3. While the teachers have consented to temporarily suspend several of their contractual working conditions, no comparable accommodations have come from your office, I said. Single session does not relieve overcrowding, and it is wrong for the public to be given the impression, as it had come through the news media, that the problem is being solved by the new schedule. The letter concluded with an appeal to the high school superintendent to make good his pledge to keep the enrollment to an absolute minimum by placing a freeze on new admissions until the size of the student body was reduced through normal attrition. The admission of 40 to 50 additional students each month will most assuredly prevent the school from getting back on its feet and carrying on a normal educational program. Zach responded with,
I must say I am deeply disturbed about what you propose, the freeze on new admissions, and the manner in which you state it.
He insisted that any such relief for Lane would impose impossible burdens on other schools, and he proceeded to give statistics showing that many other high schools were operating at even higher rates of overutilization. It was the same approach of playing the needs of one school off against others, and in the end doing nothing for any. Still another week passed in November, and no change of sessions. Things were cooling, it seemed, and there was less pressure to make the session shift. But on November 25 the school erupted again, fights broke out, and a firebomb was thrown from an upper-floor window into the courtyard below. There were several confrontations between police and black youths. Several of the students were arrested on charges of disorderly conduct. To the militants the flag issue was still very much alive. They had declared a section of the cafeteria to be their turf, and there, each day, a delegation was entrusted with the duty of keeping the Black Liberation flag displayed atop the table. There was a standoff, with the administration electing to take no further action on the flag question. On November 25, however, the militants decided to step up their campaign and tried to hoist their flag high over the cafeteria. Several teachers intervened, touching off another spree. Black students charged out of the cafeteria and up to the 4th floor, where one ended up wrestling with a policeman. In front of the auditorium a patrolman was surrounded by an angry mob of blacks. The school was on the verge of another full-scale riot. For Bauman and Johnson it was the last straw. They had consulted and compromised, they felt, and had been deceived by Zach and Celeb, and sold out by their own union leadership. The militants who had initiated the disruption had been suspended earlier for 5 days and were returned to school. For the first time in all the 6 weeks of conflict the UFT chairman publicly threatened a strong direct action by the chapter.
We were promised a single session,
they said.
But nothing has been done to relieve the serious overcrowding which makes the single session technically impossible. We're not quite sure what kind of job action would take place, but something could be done very soon.
Celeb had flip-flopped once too often, and when he began advocating the end-to-end idea as a substitute for the single session which had been promised, his fundamental integrity was subject to question by the union chapter. The word had come down through UFT channels that Brown had reneged and was now in favor of the end-to-end plan which provided for 2 totally separate school sessions each day. Under that kind of setup, which was already being utilized in a few high schools, the younger students would arrive at noon and depart about 6 p.m. The upper grades, juniors and seniors, would begin their school day at about 7 a.m. and be finished by noon. Under this system only half the student body would ever be in the building at any given time, theoretically, and there would be no need to maintain the student cafeteria which was a perennial trouble spot. It was a plan that was totally unacceptable to the UFT chapter. While the session feud simmered, the school board continued its charade of giving lip service to efforts to combat high school disruption. On November 9, Board President Montserrat announced that student dissent would be tolerated in the schools only if it was non-violent and did not interfere with normal educational processes. But Montserrat failed to make the distinction between student dissent, which was essentially an educational matter, and the kind of lawlessness which in the society at large came under the purview of the police department. His comments reflected a clear unwillingness to admit that the disruptions went well beyond the scope of student dissent. In an effort to appease the Student Union, SDS, ASA, and Panther-connected radicals which were operating quite openly in the public high schools, Seymour Lockman, Brooklyn's board member, sponsored a resolution calling for increased students' rights. Included in the board proposal were provisions giving students exclusive control over student newspapers free of administrative censorship, the right to wear political armbands and other badges of symbolic expression. Black Panther buttons were especially popular at Lane, and the right to prepare and distribute political literature on school premises. The proposal elicited a wave of criticism from parents, teachers, and administrators. In his carefully prepared statement, Montserrat tried to pacify the critics by announcing,
"Teachers have a right to teach in a climate free from harassment and other disruptions. Parents have a right to expect that their children are safe in school and can pursue a meaningful education. Among the several rights of pupils themselves is the right to learn without interference from their schoolmates and the right to be free from illegal assault at the hands of any persons."
These were familiar words. They had been uttered by his predecessor, John Doerr, by Nathan Brown, and by Donovan before him. And even by the mayor himself. It was old hat to students who had been victimized by student dissent and to parents who had already lost faith in the ability and the will of the public school authorities to protect their children. The militants had been enormously successful in polarizing the student body at Lane, of generating unrest, and of igniting the fires of racial turmoil in schools throughout the city. Few who had lived through the nightmare took Montserrat's words seriously, even when the board president stated,
"Assaults on fellow students and others, and demonstrations that interfere with normal instruction will not be tolerated." At the same time that we ask principals and teachers to promote a truly democratic atmosphere in the schools, we promise them also our full support of any actions to ensure proper order and effective learning, including the arrest and exclusion from school of students who inflict injury on others or damage property.
But the Lockman proposals on student rights weren't winning many friends. Most educators recognized the document as a farce because the plan was impossible to administer. Lockman's plan removed areas of responsibility from principals which state law mandated they exercise. Louis Shooker, the veteran principal of Jamaica High School in Queens, exposed the proposal in a critical letter to the board sponsor, telling Lockman,
"I find that the vast majority of parents are less concerned with students' rights at the present moment than they are with the increasingly disruptive and menacing atmosphere of the schools to which they must send their children. During the past several days, we have learned of the latest disturbances at Adams, Forest Hills, and Franklin K. Lane. In my experience, it is not the vast majority of youngsters, modest about their attainments and certitudes, who need a Bill of Rights for their defense in a city which has been child-centered for a generation. The majority of high school students today need psychological and sometimes even physical protection against the small minority of aggressive, dogmatic, negative, and loudly assertive adolescents who dominate the scene."
After a lengthy ridicule of the Lockman plan, charging the board member with abdication to the most violent elements of the student community, Shooker concluded,
"The omitted preamble to the board resolution justly decries the dehumanization of our schools, noting they have become too large and impersonal. Here is where the Board of Education could make a real contribution to the improvement of the high schools. For 40 years, to my knowledge, the high schools have been overcrowded and on multiple sessions. What we don't need is more rhetoric encouraging greater permissiveness. What we don't need at this point is the weakening and undermining of the authority of the school administration, which has through every form of legerdemain kept these large monsters operating with amazing efficiency and even educational success. What we do need desperately is 20 buildings within the next 2 years to end the unconscionable overcrowding which has afflicted the high schools. It is the overcrowding which sends pupils to school at dawn and has other pupils traveling home after dark. It is overcrowding that deprives teachers of a room of their own and hampers development of warm, interpersonal relationships with pupils and produces dangerous anonymity. Unfortunately, without strictly enforced regulations, 5,000 pupils could never be safely scheduled into a school built for 3,000. It is the overcrowding that has necessitated many of the rigidities, restrictions, and regulations that have offended, and many of the grievances would be dissipated as the overcrowding diminished.
It wasn't politic to oppose the Lockman Plan, and, as it had done with the board's earlier student suspense decree, the union was quiet on the issue of student rights. The board was doing the expedient thing, and the union, ever so fearful of impeding its own image-restoring program, did not object. But the school board received its own first personal glimpse of student anarchy at its November 12 public meeting at the Fashion Institute of Technology in Manhattan. The meeting, which attracted about 700 persons from all over the city, was for the purpose of holding an open forum on Lockman's document, which he called The Rights and Responsibilities of High School Students. Only a few days earlier the Afro-American Students Association had held a general meeting at JHS 271 in Ocean Hill and had decided to attend the board's public session to protest the resolution, which they felt didn't go far enough, and counter it with a list of black students' demands. Lane's militants were well represented in the 40-member ASA delegation that forced the school board vice president, Murray Bertram, to adjourn the meeting at 9:30 p.m. before the controversial item could be debated by the speakers who had come for the specific purpose of stating the views of various public and private organizations. The ASA militants took control of the floor microphones and began reading a list of 15 demands to the board. Responding with vulgarities whenever a board member tried to remind them of proper protocol and decorum, the students intensified their barrage. People who had attended public meetings for years claimed they had never seen anything resembling the fascistic tactics of the black student militants. One observer, representing a coalition of high school parents' associations, said,
"The demonstration was not a spontaneous uprising. Black students had been going up and down the aisles seeking support. If there's any future for the New York City school system, somebody better step in and do something."
For at least 30 minutes the well-trained students expertly carried through on their avowed aim of breaking up the school board's public meeting. One of Lane's most notorious militants, a girl, read the group's 15 demands to the board.
An end to automatic suspension of students. Ban police and police aides from schools. Adhere to fire regulations by keeping open all school doors. Open schools to daily parental observation. Eliminate the general course of study. Suspend regents' examinations.
Statewide end-of-term tests.
Because they are racist. Alter teacher qualifying examinations to make black educators proportional to the student population. Check books and educational materials to determine their adequacy. Create school clubs along ethnic lines, such as all-black organizations to be supported by the school's general organization fund. Provide music in lunch rooms and more dances, and athletic programs with rifle clubs and self-defense classes instead of games. Ensure that teachers have the background to teach courses such as Black Studies. Create student-faculty councils with equal representation to make decisions on curriculum, staffing, discipline, and school regulations. Reorganize high schools along community lines so black students will not have to attend schools in hostile communities.
November 12 came and passed, and the board had witnessed the reckless abandon of those they were seeking to appease with their program of student rights. To every sincere observer it was perfectly clear that the militants weren't the least bit interested in defining and protecting student rights, but rather with the exploitation of avenues of controversy to bring forth more violence, more disruption, more polarization. 3 months later the school board tried again, holding another public meeting on the Lockman proposals. But once again the meeting was disrupted by student militants, and again Bertram ordered an early adjournment that denied private citizens and groups the right to present their views to the school board. All through the month of November Franklin K. Lane functioned haphazardly, a powder keg that could explode at any time. Racial tensions and violence intensified throughout the month. It was common knowledge that most of the very same militant leaders who had provoked the October 31st riot and subsequent disruptions were back in school doing their thing. By this time many had undergone even more indoctrination as evidenced by their brash statements to school authorities. One assistant dean noted that a key leader of the militants had told him,
"I am committed to continued violence at Lane.
and added,
If anybody tries to take down our flag, there will be a bloodbath, and the white kids will get it."
These remarks were recorded on the student's disciplinary record, and the deans insisted that the information be brought directly to the principal's attention. But Celeb flatly denied knowledge of any such statements and later chastised the assistant dean for having brought the threats to the attention of the union. Meanwhile, Zach had promised that student disruptors would not be permitted to return to Lane, and yet no less than 8 such youngsters who had been given the maximum 5-day principal's suspension were all returned to the school when the high school office and/or Celeb decided to drop the cases. Even when one of the militants told a dean,
"You better start thinking about your wife and kids,"
there was no sense of urgency on the part of the bureaucrats to invoke the measures available to them to remove the school delinquents. Attacks by black students against whites continued. Whites stayed out of lavatories, the auditorium, and the student cafeteria. The auditorium, especially, had become a den. It was there that a white girl had been attacked by a group of 5 black girls, stripped of all her clothing from the waist up, beaten and kicked. It was also the place where a white boy had his hair set afire by a group of blacks. Soon, even the deans were challenging the principal for his inaction. Their job was to maintain safety, but they found their efforts to remove the violence stymied by the principal. Celeb, in turn, pointed to the new suspense law which, he claimed, prevented him from moving against the provocateurs. By the end of November the staff was totally demoralized, with many teachers refusing to make even the slightest attempt to enforce school discipline. For many it was a question of their own survival. The mere request for a student's identification card had come to be considered an act of provocation. Teachers stopped asking. In those grim November days a fatality would have come as no surprise to anyone who spent any amount of time in the school that month. It seemed as if the cheapest commodity was the very life of a child. As conditions worsened, all signs pointed to the prospect of Celeb being removed as principal. The school's UFT chapter, however, had never been among the groups, parent and student, who were demanding his dismissal. It was a faculty-splitting issue, and one which the UFT chairman chose to avoid. Neither had any great love for Celeb, but they realized that as a probationer since his arrival at Lane in 1967, he had no tenure in his rank and could not be expected to assert any authority if it went contrary to the wishes of the higher-ups. For Celeb, they believed, tenure was the name of the game, and he would do nothing to jeopardize that $26,000 salary, $7,000 over his previous pay as department chairman, which would increase automatically in the next 3 years to a top of $32,000. Most teachers felt that Celeb would be replaced, transferred, or kicked upstairs to a post at board headquarters after June 1970, and that his only real concern was getting tenure and the $32,000 guaranteed income that came with it. The suspicion that Celeb was on his way out was given even greater credence when the board sent a principal in training, Sol Levine, to sharpen his spurs in Lane's wars. Levine, 37 years young, arrived on the scene with a reputation as an outstanding administrator, the man who had put out the racial fires in another Brooklyn high school, Canarsie, the year before. As the rumor of a Celeb for Levine swap grew louder, the chapter leaders made their own personal position clear. They were unalterably opposed to making Celeb the scapegoat. They, who had been among his severest critics, knew that a switch would mean another 3 years with a probationary principal. How different things might have been had there been a strong, experienced, and tenured man at the helm during those tumultuous years. Would a secure and knowledgeable principal have permitted the board bureaucrats to bury the school, and would he have allowed it to sink to these depths? Celeb had certainly contributed to the downfall, they felt, but he was better than the alternative proposition of going through another 3-year probationary period with a brand new man and the "don't rock the boat, boys" attitude that went along with it. As bad as Celeb had been, they were willing to gamble with him, hoping that he would be a different administrator once granted his tenure. Lane had been leaderless for so long that another probationer was exactly what the school did not need. The speculation about Sol Levine's future ended on March 16, 1970, when he was permanently assigned as the principal of George Washington High School in Upper Manhattan, a school that had been racked with violence and shut down early on 13 consecutive days over the demand by a group of adult agitators to operate a grievance table for students in the school's lobby. As the final days of the fall semester approached, a question arose as to the type of physical organization the school would have for the new term beginning in February. Zach had promised an immediate conversion to a single session in November, but later backed off, leaving the decision to implement it in Celeb's hands. Albert Shanker and Nathan Brown had conferred often on the Lane question, and in spite of the November pledge, Brown now told the union leaders that he would order the end-to-end session for February. On December 9, Zach came to a meeting of the Lane Parents Association and announced that the superintendent was still undecided about the sessions for February. In reality, Brown didn't want to make the decision, not wanting to be held accountable if the school blew under the end-to-end plan. Brown passed the buck to Zach, hoping the high school chief would give the order, but Zach had made the single-session promise before a full faculty meeting at Lane and wasn't about to be called a liar by 300 teachers. He, in turn, left the decision to Celeb, who announced his preference for the end-to-end arrangement over the single session. Choosing to subvert the pledges made on November 3, the principal called a full faculty conference on December 15 to try to sway the staff to his way of thinking on the end-to-end idea. But Celeb made a poor case and was no match for Bauman and Johnson, who had done their homework. On the day of the meeting, they distributed to the faculty copies of a 4-page study entitled An Analysis of End-to-End Organization. After setting forth the advantages and disadvantages of both end-to-end and single session, the chairman concluded with their own views and preferences, as follows.
The chapter council is unanimous in its opposition to an end-to-end session at Lane as a solution to our problems. We might add that the Parents Association expressed their opposition to such a plan at the November 26 meeting of the Principals Consultative Council. We feel that an end-to-end session is a drastic measure that may ease the problem of the cafeteria but does not address itself to the disorders and disruptions related to outside agitation, cutting, truancy, classroom behavior, narcotics, conditions in the halls, and school tone in general. We believe the administration must implement existing rules with determination and develop new rules to re-establish discipline and create and maintain a safe atmosphere for students and teachers alike. A mere substitution of new rules and new schedules without provision for their enforcement isn't the answer. Existing machinery can deal with the present problem if the responsibility of power is utilized. In our opinion, it is a comparatively small minority of the student body who are refusing to conform or cooperate with the rules of the school community. To permit the disruption of the education of approximately 4,800 students and impose hardships on the entire professional staff because of their actions is to submit to the tyranny of the minority to the detriment of all. We must not allow any individual group or organization to sell out education to achieve peace at any price. The future may well be that of continued and additional pressures and the watering down of the quality of education in the public schools by methods like the end-to-end session to restore peace and quiet. But this will most assuredly continue the trend away from the public schools by those who want real education for their children. Those who cannot run will remain in a city school system whose greatest asset will be the ability to respond to the politically expedient rather than the educational need. Not even hope will remain.
The entire faculty, almost to the man, voted to sustain the union recommendation. Lane opened with a single session in February 1970, a session which at least offered hope that an educational program could be conducted, and that the school would be returned to the mainstream of the academic community. Students, parents, and teachers held their breath, and waited.